Picture Rome around 30 AD, a city where most people considered themselves fortunate if they could afford decent bread and olive oil for dinner, where the average citizen viewed meat as an occasional luxury, and where a truly elaborate meal might consist of some garum fish sauce, a few olives, and perhaps a bit of cheese if you were feeling particularly extravagant. In this world of practical eating and modest culinary expectations, there lived a man named Marcus Gavius Apicius, who spent the equivalent of millions of modern dollars on single meals and approached food with the kind of passionate intensity that most people reserved for religion or warfare. If you're enjoying this deep dive into ancient Roman extravagance, consider liking and subscribing for more incredible stories from history that'll blow your mind. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Apicius wasn't just wealthy. Rome had plenty of wealthy people who spent money on reasonable luxuries like slaves, elaborate houses, and expensive entertainment. He was wealthy in service to an obsession so profound and all-consuming that it transformed him into something unprecedented in Roman culture. The world's first celebrity chef, food critic, and culinary innovator, all wrapped into one person whose approach to eating made even the most indulgent Roman nobles look positively modest by comparison. His dinner parties became legendary throughout the empire, not because they were large or politically important, but because they pushed the boundaries of what human beings could conceive of doing with food. These weren't mere social gatherings, they were culinary expeditions into uncharted territory, where guests found themselves experiencing flavors and preparations that challenged every assumption they had about what eating could be. Picture arriving at one of Apicius's banquets and discovering that he'd spent 6 months developing a sauce that required ingredients from 3 different continents, or finding yourself served a dish that incorporated cooking techniques so innovative that professional chefs would still be discussing them centuries later. His kitchens operated less like food preparation areas and more like experimental laboratories, where teams of specialized cooks worked under his direction to create experiences that existed somewhere between meals and performance art. The scale of his operations was staggering. At any given time, Apicius employed dozens of specialists who did nothing but focus on perfecting individual aspects of his culinary vision. Some dedicated their entire careers to understanding the subtle differences between various types of salt and how each would affect different preparations. Others became experts in the precise timing required to achieve perfect textures in sauces that incorporated ingredients from multiple climate zones. This was a man who once heard about particularly excellent oysters being harvested near Britain and immediately chartered ships to bring them fresh to his table, despite the fact that the journey took weeks and cost more than most Romans spent on housing in a year. When he learned about a type of exotic mushroom that grew only in certain forests in Gaul, he dispatched agents to negotiate exclusive purchasing agreements with local tribes, ensuring that these delicacies would appear on no table but his own. His approach to ingredients was that of a collector pursuing the rarest manuscripts, or an artist seeking the perfect pigments. Price was irrelevant. What mattered was achieving flavors that no one else had ever experienced. He maintained correspondences with traders throughout the Mediterranean and beyond, constantly seeking new spices, unusual wines, and exotic delicacies that could elevate his culinary creations to heights that mere wealth alone could never reach. But Apicius wasn't content simply to consume the finest ingredients available. He wanted to transform them into something entirely new. His kitchens became centers of innovation, where traditional Roman cooking methods were revolutionized through techniques he developed specifically to enhance and complement the expensive ingredients he collected from across the known world. Roman cuisine before Apicius was practical and straightforward, designed to provide nutrition and basic pleasure without unnecessary complexity. Meals were social occasions, certainly, but the food itself was typically simple preparations that allowed conversation and companionship to provide the entertainment. Think of it like the difference between a neighborhood barbecue and a modern molecular gastronomy restaurant. Both involve food, but they exist in completely different universes of expectation and experience. Apicius transformed eating into an art form where the meal itself became the primary experience, where every bite was crafted to deliver specific combinations of flavors, textures, and aromas that had been carefully orchestrated to create something approaching culinary perfection. He understood that food could be a form of storytelling, with each course building upon the previous one to create narrative arcs that engaged diners on both sensory and intellectual levels. He wrote what became Rome's most famous cookbook, a collection of recipes so elaborate and expensive that they read less like practical cooking instructions and more like fantasy literature for people who dreamed of unlimited culinary budgets. His recipes called for ingredients that required international trade networks to obtain and preparation methods that demanded skilled technicians rather than ordinary household cooks. Yet, for all his extravagance, Apicius possessed genuine expertise that earned him respect even from people who found his lifestyle absurd. Professional cooks throughout the empire studied his innovations, adapting his techniques for more modest budgets and everyday ingredients. His understanding of how different flavors combined and enhanced each other influenced Roman cuisine for generations, introducing concepts of culinary sophistication that would eventually spread throughout the Mediterranean world. When Apicius decided to host a dinner party, the preparation began months in advance. Not because he was particularly slow in his planning, but because achieving the level of culinary perfection he demanded required the kind of coordination typically associated with military campaigns or major construction projects. His household staff included specialists whose entire careers were devoted to single aspects of food preparation, experts in spice combinations, masters of sauce making, and technicians who understood the precise timing required to transform expensive ingredients into transcendent dining experiences. His kitchen operated on principles that would have seemed familiar to modern molecular gastronomists or Michelin-starred chefs, though the technology available to him was considerably more primitive. Without refrigeration, preserving delicate ingredients required constant attention and innovative techniques. Without modern transportation, obtaining fresh seafood from distant waters meant maintaining complex networks of fast couriers and carefully timed deliveries. Without standardized measurements or temperature controls, achieving consistency in his elaborate preparations demanded the kind of intuitive expertise that could only be developed through years of obsessive experimentation. The dining room where Apicius entertained his guests was designed specifically to enhance the food rather than simply providing a pleasant social atmosphere. Every detail, from the arrangement of couches to the selection of serving vessels, was chosen to complement and elevate the culinary experience. He commissioned special plates and bowls that would enhance the visual presentation of specific dishes, understanding that the appearance of food was as important as its taste in creating the total sensory experience he wanted his guests to remember. His approach to menu planning resembled what we might recognize as early fusion cuisine, combining flavors and techniques from different regions of the empire in ways that created entirely new taste experiences. A typical Apicius dinner might feature appetizers inspired by Spanish cooking methods, main courses that incorporated North African spice combinations, and desserts that used preservation techniques learned from Egyptian confectioners, all unified by his own innovations in sauce making and ingredient preparation. The wines served at these gatherings were selected with the same obsessive attention to detail that characterized everything else about his entertaining. Apicius maintained relationships with vineyard owners throughout the Mediterranean, not just to ensure access to the finest vintages, but to influence the actual production methods used in creating wines that would complement his specific culinary creations. He would commission custom blends designed to enhance particular dishes, treating wine not as a separate beverage, but as an integral component of the overall flavor profile he was constructing. His guests often found themselves experiencing combinations of tastes and textures that challenged their understanding of what food could be. Apicius delighted in creating dishes that surprised even sophisticated palates, introducing Roman nobles to flavor profiles they had never imagined possible. These weren't mere novelties or exotic curiosities. They were carefully crafted experiences designed to demonstrate how creative cooking could elevate eating from mere sustenance to something approaching artistic expression. The economic impact of Apicius's culinary obsessions rippled throughout the Mediterranean trading networks. His demand for exotic ingredients created new markets and trade routes, encouraging merchants to seek out rare spices and unusual delicacies that could command premium prices from wealthy Roman customers. Entire regions began specializing in products that had previously been local curiosities, understanding that Apicius's approval could transform modest local ingredients into valuable export commodities. His purchasing power was so significant that he could influence agricultural practices in distant provinces. When he developed a preference for a particular type of olive oil, the producers would modify their cultivation and processing methods to meet his specifications. When he discovered a wine that pleased him, the vineyard would expand production and attempt to replicate the exact conditions that had created that perfect vintage. This kind of market influence was unprecedented for someone whose profession was essentially professional eating, but it reflected the broader cultural changes that were transforming Roman society during the early imperial period. Wealth was becoming concentrated in the hands of individuals who had both the resources and the inclination to pursue personal passions on a scale that affected entire economic sectors. Apicius represented something new in Roman culture, a person whose individual preferences could reshape entire industries simply through the exercise of informed purchasing power. He wasn't a general whose decisions affected military campaigns, or a senator whose policies influenced governance, but his choices about what to eat had consequences that reached from Spanish olive groves to Egyptian spice markets. In many ways, he was like a one-man economic engine, creating demand that drove innovation and expansion across multiple industries. By the time Apicius had been pursuing his culinary passions for several decades, his reputation had evolved from that of an eccentric wealthy Roman to something approaching a cultural institution. Food lovers throughout the empire knew his name, and his approval could transform unknown ingredients into sought-after delicacies virtually overnight. Professional cooks competed for opportunities to work in his kitchens, understanding that training under his direction provided credentials that could secure employment in the finest households throughout the Mediterranean world. Now, you might think this sounds like the perfect life, but here's the dark twist that nobody saw coming. This success came with a price that extended far beyond the enormous sums he spent on individual meals. Apicius had created a lifestyle so expensive and so dependent on constant innovation that it required not just wealth, but continuously increasing wealth to maintain. Each dinner party had to surpass the previous one in creativity and extravagance, which meant that his costs were rising exponentially, even as his standards for acceptable quality became more demanding and exclusive. More troubling than the mere expense was the psychological pressure that came with having established a reputation for culinary perfection that constantly demanded new achievements. Apicius had become trapped by his own success, unable to serve merely excellent food to guests who expected revolutionary experiences every time they dined at his table. The creative pressure of continuously surpassing his previous accomplishments was as demanding as the financial cost of obtaining the ingredients necessary to attempt such innovations. Roman society, despite its general acceptance of luxury and extravagance among the wealthy, began to find Apicius's obsession somewhat uncomfortable to witness. There's a point at which even a culture that celebrates excess becomes nervous about individuals who pursue any single passion with such complete disregard for conventional limitations, and Apicius had clearly passed that point in the minds of many of his contemporaries. The financial mathematics of his situation became increasingly precarious as he aged, and his desire for ever more elaborate culinary experiences continued to expand. Unlike other forms of luxury spending, which typically involved purchasing durable goods that retained at least some value over time, Apicius's passion literally consumed his wealth, transforming vast sums of money into memorable experiences that left nothing behind except recipes and the gradually fading memories of extraordinary meals. As his financial advisors became increasingly nervous about his spending patterns, Apicius faced a dilemma that would have been incomprehensible to most Romans. He had enough money remaining to live comfortably for the rest of his life, but not enough to continue pursuing food with the kind of unlimited creativity that had made his existence meaningful to him. The prospect of eating merely excellent meals, of dining on ingredients that cost hundreds rather than thousands of denarii, of entertaining guests with food that was simply very good rather than revolutionary, apparently seemed worse to him than no longer eating at all. His friends and family attempted to convince him that moderation might be possible, that perhaps he could find satisfaction in applying his expertise to creating wonderful meals within more reasonable budgets. But for someone who had devoted his entire adult life to pushing the boundaries of what culinary art could achieve, the idea of accepting limitations apparently felt like a kind of death that would come before his actual death. The decision he ultimately made reflects both the genuine depth of his passion for food and the profound isolation that can come from pursuing any obsession to its ultimate conclusion. Rather than accept what he viewed as culinary mediocrity, Apicius chose to end his life while his memories of perfect meals remained intact, while his reputation for excellence was still untarnished by the compromises that financial necessity would have required. The final dinner party that Apicius hosted before making this tragic decision became, perhaps inevitably, the most legendary meal in Roman history, though not for the reasons he had originally intended. Knowing that this would be his last opportunity to demonstrate the culinary artistry that had defined his existence, he planned a menu that represented the culmination of everything he had learned about transforming expensive ingredients into transcendent experiences. The meal itself was structured as a kind of edible autobiography, with each course representing different periods of his career and different innovations he'd contributed to Roman cuisine. Early courses featured dishes that had established his reputation decades earlier, prepared with a kind of refinement that comes from years of perfecting techniques that had once seemed revolutionary, but had since become accepted parts of sophisticated cooking throughout the empire. Later courses introduced flavors and combinations that even his regular guests had never experienced, representing months of experimentation with ingredients so rare and expensive that obtaining them had required negotiations with the traders from the furthest reaches of the known world. The wine served throughout the evening had been selected from his personal collection, bottles that represented the finest production of vineyards throughout the Mediterranean and beyond. When the meal concluded and the guests departed, they carried with them memories of an experience that would influence their understanding of food for the rest of their lives. But Apicius himself faced the morning after his greatest culinary triumph with the knowledge that he lacked the resources to ever again achieve the kind of innovation and excellence that had made his life meaningful. His death sent shockwaves through Roman society, not because such tragic endings were particularly unusual among the wealthy elite, but because the reason for his choice seemed to reveal something disturbing about the potential consequences of pursuing any passion without regard for practical limitations. His story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of allowing personal desires to override the social responsibilities that were supposed to come with great wealth and cultural influence. Yet his legacy in the realm of food remained enormous and positive. The cookbook he'd compiled during his lifetime continued to influence Roman cuisine for centuries, with his recipes being adapted and modified to suit different budgets and regional ingredients. Professional cooks throughout the empire continued to study his innovations in sauce making, spice combination, and presentation techniques that had elevated Roman dining from mere sustenance to something approaching artistic expression. Modern culinary historians recognize Apicius as a pivotal figure in the development of European cuisine, someone whose innovations and standards established principles that would influence cooking throughout the Mediterranean world for centuries. His emphasis on ingredient quality, flavor combination, and visual presentation anticipates many of the concerns that would characterize fine dining in later periods, making him arguably the first celebrity chef in recorded history. The story of Apicius reminds us that the pursuit of excellence, while admirable and often productive, can become destructive when it transforms from a method of creating beauty into an obsession that consumes everything else that makes existence worthwhile. He achieved genuine artistic greatness in his chosen field, but his inability to find meaning in anything other than culinary perfection prevented him from enjoying the very achievements that made him remarkable. That's the incredible and tragic story of Apicius, the Roman who literally loved food to death. What did you think of this ancient tale of obsession and artistry? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this deep dive into Roman history, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more fascinating stories from the ancient world. See you in the next video.